Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Fi podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. Now, I am again joined by Florian. Pleasure having you here tonight, Florian.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so this is our 11th casual stream where we talk about punctuated equilibria. So, Florian, you said you have a presentation, so why don't you go through that?
Yeah. Okay. Can you see everything? Let me see.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So thanks for listening. So we're talking about punctuated equilibrium, and that's kind of like a submodel in the modern evolutionary theory, and was introduced like almost 55 years ago by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. They had one like big paper in the 1970s, 1971 about it, and it contains most of what we talk about when we say punctuated equilibrium. So in most evolutionary theory, evolution occurs slowly and steadily across geologic time, right? And that's called phyletic gradualism. So gradualism because it's gradual change, and phyletic because you have different phyla of organisms, right? So these change very gradual over millions of years. But we see sometimes that there's a lot of morphological stasis. We don't just see many intermediate forms, but we see a burst of new forms. Just talked to Todd about it. The Cambrian explosion would be a classic example by burst. I mean, it's also called explosion, right? You have all of a sudden you have all these new forms coming up in the Cambrian era, and before the fossils that you had before, they're not very. There's not much change, and all of a sudden you have all these new forms. So how can that be if evolution operates gradually? Okay, right? Is this due to an incomplete record, or is this just how evolution works after all? So, this is an example of the phylogenetic gradualism that I talked about. Here we have something called a Gryphea, which is a fossilized oyster. They are extinct, but they exist as fossils. And million MA means million years. So when you see Gryphea dumertieri, this is 198 million years ago, 196 million years ago, 195. So time proceeds here, and you can see that this in the span of like 18 million years, you go from this small Gryphea oyster to the large Gryphea, and you can quantify the whorls. You call it like these small whorls around it, also called whorls. And if you look at the number of whorls, it's just like a quarter here in the very beginning, and then you have 1.5 whorls, like it becomes broader and more elaborate, right? And then gradually you get with increasing time, you get a little bit more whorls. So it's basically the same oyster, but it just changes a little bit over time, not very much. And so Gould and Eldridge come up with the model for punctuated equilibrium. So first saying that a species typically exhibits stasis for most of their history. They don't change much in the form. And then you have something called allopatric speciation. That is when all of a sudden a part of the population becomes geologically isolated, right? All of a sudden, let's say maybe a small part of the landmass breaks off and an island forms, or for whatever reason there is a fire, like a lot of forest is destroyed, and you have all of a sudden this isolated area, or you have a mountain arising, and we're talking about millions of years here. So you get a mountain arising, and all of a sudden, like at one point, you have this part of the population that is split off, right? And so now you have a very small geographically isolated area. And so in that small area, you can have very, very rapid evolutionary change. It's still gradual, but much more quickly gradual than in the rest of the population. And then it gets so quickly that you even have a speciation event in the end. and then maybe those new species, they can take over the old hunting grounds, and then that means that you look at the same area and all of a sudden you find like a huge explosion of new species. They probably, that the punctuated equilibrium would say those species probably evolved in a separate area and then somehow came back together with the original population from which they split off. Now they're looking completely different. And you can actually have a thought experiment. Let me see. There we go. So when you start with this snail, and you have species A, and now you have an isolation here, geographic, right? Now, in subspecies X and subspecies Y forms, because in one geographic area, the whole snail becomes a little slimmer, and then in the other area, the snail becomes a little broader, right? And then over time, these broader snails become even more broader, and they're like really short and stumped, and these subspecies X becomes ever more slim and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And then you have in the end species B and species C. These two have all evolved gradually, but one of them went in that direction and the other one went in that direction. And now you basically don't have an intermediate form between those two. Those two look like two completely different species, right? And so that's one model how punctuated equilibrium works. And a part of the population gets geographically isolated. And then since it's a smaller population, evolution can occur much more rapidly. And that goes as far as you can say that becomes a speciation. So a new species is born, and that speciation is fast. So you think about if you change, if you have some mutations that appear in a population of 100 individuals, right? You have like one or two mutations that appear. Those mutations will much more rapidly spread through a total of 100 individuals if that forms a population, and that expands. But then you have like few mutations in there and they can spread rapidly. But in a big population of like, if you have two mutations in a sea of 1 million individuals, that those two mutations just simply will not see the time of the day, and will also, if they do, they spread much more slowly, right? So that's basically the groundwork of punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium basically means that organisms are in an equilibrium. They don't change much with the environment. And then punctuated means this equilibrium is interrupted. There's like a rapid burst of new species arriving on the scene. So it's not a mathematical model at all. It's just a qualitative hypothesis, and basically say that the stasis is basically interrupted. Instead of punctuated equilibrium, you could probably also say interrupted stasis, right? And let me see. Yeah. So as I said, speciation is fast, and sometimes the old species reunite with the new ones, or basically, basically you find them in fossil digs and like close to one another, but they were once geographically isolated according to punctuated equilibrium. And the implications of paleontology are, of course, that you wouldn't expect gradual transitions in the fossil record if that model is accurate. And maybe we should reevaluate the existing fossil data with this new lens. And the absence of intermediate with punctuated equilibrium, the absence of intermediates would still support evolutionary theory instead of invalidating it. So basically, they challenge conventional assumptions, punctuated equilibria about tempo and mode of evolution. And it also means that macroevolution, so the birth of new species, cannot be easily inferred just from microevolution, right? You can't just say, okay, change is gradual, from like very gradual, so small that we don't see it. But over longer, if you just give it enough time, it gets into macroevolution. No, it's a kind of a different mechanism because mutations are spreading much more meaningfully and much quicker through a smaller geographically isolated area. And so you probably have to account for different mechanisms, or at least that's a possibility. And you need more empirical work, but this model can bridge gaps between paleontology and evolutionary theory. And yeah, that's basically the short introduction into punctuated equilibrium.
Okay, yeah. So a few things, because I also looked at some videos that were talking about this, and of course Grok. Always, and nowadays we can just go to Grok. But what the thing that, so okay, the main difference, if you will, as you've pointed out, is the importance of small populations that are geographically isolated.
Yeah.
And so any change that occurs, it takes fewer iterations for that change to affect every individual within that population group. Okay, that makes sense. The problem is, I don't see how that accelerates speciation. It just means that the absorption of a new trait occurs more quickly. I don't really see how that actually increases. Oh, whoops. Hold on a second. Didn't mean to do that. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I was trying to close a window and I kicked Florian out. That was unfortunate. Sorry about that, Florian. I was trying to close a window and kicked you out by accident.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but back to my point, I'll just reiterate quickly. So yeah, I get it. Small population, isolated, so one change can be absorbed faster. But that, to me, only talks about the rate of absorbing the change, not accelerating the intervals of change at speciation. So let's say we have, I don't know, from one species to a completely different species, you need, I don't know, let's just say 1,000 intervals. An isolated population absorbing an interval faster doesn't necessarily increase the rate at which you have one interval to the next. It just means that the absorption of that interval occurs more quickly. So I don't really see how it speeds up the rapid steps of intervals.
But you would, yes, but that's true. But you would basically have a mutation in gene A. And if that's a big population, that mutation will just go under, because the individual with that mutation may actually get progeny, get procreate with another individual who doesn't have that mutation, and then that mutation basically gets like, all after a time, it just gets lost from that lineage. And if you have a smaller overall population, then it is more the likelihood that one of these mutations are actually going to manifest is much larger. Ergo, the chance of having a real mutation that you see manifest in the phenotype, that you really see, and that's really not just like some random noise in some of the genes, that it's the likelihood that you hit a real one that then gets propagated through the population much quicker is higher. So in end effect, that means that you experience it much quicker.
Well, okay, so like I said, the absorption rate would be quicker, and the presentation of the necessary gene change would be quicker. But to go from one species to another, and I'm choosing an arbitrary number to help quantify this, let's say it takes 1,000 distinct iterations. In one sense, because there's less time to absorb stuff, you will have a shorter time from intervals. But I don't see how that's qualitatively fast enough to describe what PE is talking about, because PE is basically saying that you can have changes within 100,000 years from one species to the next.
Yeah.
And I just don't see. I mean, for example, the Galapagos finches, according to the standard model, have been isolated for 3 million years, and yet they're not that different from other finches. So why haven't we seen what PE would predict in the Galapagos finches?
I guess one would say PE isn't replacing gradual. PE isn't replacing phylogenetic gradualism. Let's call it PG. They can still coexist, and for whatever reason, PE didn't happen in that Galapagos population.
Well, yeah, that's true, because a lot of times what critics from the standard model will say that, they'll emphasize the difference rather than what they both share, right? And so the question then becomes that. Now, but then here's the other.
But if you, I try to think about to grasp it by thinking about another example. Let's say you have a small heap. Let's say you have a small heap of paper. Let's say you put a match into your trash can, right? Very rapidly, the whole trash can will be on fire, right? But if you put a match on some paper that flies around in your kitchen, not much will happen, and the whole kitchen will also not. When it catches fire, it will also take much longer time to incinerate the entire kitchen than it would take incinerating the trash can.
Right.
Even though the absorption rate, the reaction and the reaction energy and everything else is the same.
Oh yeah, I follow that, right? So in a sense, it does, that would take a lot less to burn, and then you could then, I guess, go to the next thing to burn and the next thing to burn. But that's really at that slice of speciation. If you have 1,000 steps to go through, yeah, I could see how it would still be faster on average than gradualism, but I just don't see how it would be qualitatively faster, because it's still using the same selection mechanisms, right? Because we're not just saying it's a little bit faster on average. If you have, two animals racing, one will get to the finish line a little bit faster. This is a qualitative difference where you're going from, like, the Cambrian explosion, for example, would be a quantitative jump. And since you're using all the same selection pressures and mechanisms, you're only selecting for a unique population group, which is an isolated one. I don't see how that leads to a quantitative difference. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, maybe you think about a random walk. If you have a random walk, somebody starts walking in a certain direction and then veers back and forth a little bit, it still goes in a certain direction on a smaller area. It will reach its goal much quicker than if you have a fluctuation back and forth through an entire street, right? So if you do one change and another change and another change, you can get astray pretty quickly. And if you the rate of the change itself is also random. So if you think that there's one mutation happening every 1,000 years, and then it should take the same time for that mutation to get through the population. Doesn't matter if it's a large or small population, but sometimes this is just an average, right? Sometimes change is much quicker than just like 10 generations. Sometimes change needs 100 generations to happen. If you have a smaller population, then the quick change, the mechanisms that bring about quick change have a unique chance to really spread far and wide, what they don't have in the larger population. So what you say is correct. I'm just thinking that that evolutionary change is completely unpredictable. It can occur very quickly or very slowly, and the quick parts are amplified in a small population. Therefore, the overall speed is quicker on average in a smaller population.
Right. So let me use another example to help illustrate this quality versus quantity kind of thing. So, would you agree with this proposition that no amount of merely additive change will lead to a qualitative change?
No amount of what will lead to a qualitative change?
Additive. So if I keep adding, let me give you an example. Let's say that I want to raise the quality of my soldiers in the army. Now, I'm never going to do that if I just keep recruiting more soldiers, right? I keep adding one, but they're not qualitatively better. I have a quantitatively larger army, which might be a more effective at projecting power against my neighbors, but it's not qualitatively better. That would take me improving their drill instructors. So to get the qualitative change, you don't get there by merely additive steps. Would you agree?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what I see PE trying to explain is a quantitative change. You have stasis and then a rapid change in speciation. That's a qualitative change. And given that they're using more or less all of the same selection met pressures that gradualist evolution uses, but only focusing on small isolated populations, that to me still seems to be additive. It doesn't seem to explain the quantitative change. At best, what it could do is explain small accelerations, not the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
Do you see that? Because that's what they're trying to explain. And I asked Grok this, and like, yeah, Eldritch and Gould admitted, yeah, that's a big problem. What do we do with the Cambrian explosion? That's not the only example, but that's the most prominent one. So this is a qualitative change. So what I was expecting to find when I was looking into PE was some sort of qualitatively new selection measure, but it's not. They're not proposing a new selection method. They're just proposing that under certain conditions, the already existing selection pressures could occur at a higher rate. Which, okay, I mean that is what it is, but I don't see that as explaining a qualitative change.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean it's not a real mathematical model, right? It's just an explanation of what the possible explanation that fits well with the observation, but it's not really been. I'm not even sure whether it has ever been tested experimentally.
Because what I would imagine, if you were to run a simulation, right, in a computer with a gradualist scenario for one population set, and then a punctuated equilibria scenario with another population set, the rate of change, I agree, would be faster in the PE set. But I'm arguing it doesn't appear to me that it would be fast enough to explain the vast gap between the pre and post-Cambrian dividing line. It would be a little bit faster. It's more like this. If you have two race cars, right, and then let's say some whiz designer from Italy comes up with like a really super engine, right, that just gives the one guy that got it the first time it comes out this edge. It's enough to win all the races, but they're still racing race cars. He's not flying a jet, right? It didn't give him the jet advantage. They're all still race cars. It's just it has that little extra advantage that lets him win all the races based on this new engine design. And that's kind of what I see PE is, right? It would explain why this guy might keep winning races because he's using this new engine design, because it's just that bit better, but it doesn't get you, from my point of view, from a race car to a jet.
Well, it has actually an example that you could use exactly there. Maybe not jet, but the brothers Wright I think they were bicycle mechanics, and they basically transformed the bicycle into an airplane, like, right? And at the same time, I think some industry conglomerates, they also wanted to task people with finding a way to fly, and they had like this huge budget, a huge group, and the huge group of people couldn't come up with a model of flying, but the small cell based on those two Wright brothers could quickly turn a bicycle into an airplane.
Okay,
right?
so I see what you're trying to do here, but let's look at this from another point, though. And so, for example, in The Origin of Species, Darwin is appealing to breeds of dogs or domestic animals, and of course that's done by intelligent human agency. And he then argues, well, might it not be the case that environmental pressures have a similar selection effect over time? You see, this is where I think a fundamental philosophical error is being made, and then this would also be with PE. Non-rational processes are not analogous to rational processes. They're just not. They're two fundamentally distinct processes. So the Wright brothers are human agents exercising will and decision to do something, and that's sui generis, right? Sui generis is something that doesn't occur. There's no prior example of that, right? That's the entire point. That's why it's sui generis. But in our experience, the only sui generis things are things that are produced by human minds. And I would argue that Darwin and other people are making the mistake of saying sui generis products can be the result of natural processes. I mean, I don't see that. When I look at natural processes occurring around me, I don't see sui generis products. I see humans producing sui generis products.
Yeah. Which would be by design, yeah?
Which would be by design. Right. So I would say in that case, these sui generis changes would not be indicative of non-rational forces. And that's where I would want to push back on that analogy a little bit.
Yeah, it's very difficult to really make up a difference between species, right? Because it's so many changes, so many things that make let's say humans different from cats, or that maybe even subspecies are so different from another. There are so many different changes that it's difficult to trace a path, like which mutation came first, and then and which mutation came then after. If you look at something like this moth in Great Britain, that all of a sudden, I think they were white moths and a white grayish moth, and then industrialization came along, and then all of a sudden these white moths were easy prey because everything became like sooty and black, and so you could easily see these small moths, right? So, and then over time, basically the moths with more brown pigment instead of white pigment in their wings, they had an evolutionary advantage to survive. And so on a very small level, you can identify the genes that help in making these moths darker, right? That you can do. But differences between moth species are very difficult to reconstruct, or much more difficult to reconstruct if you go to the DNA level. So yeah, it's difficult to create some kind of like a blueprint how species A went to species B, or even subspecies A became subspecies B, because also like the graphic I showed in the beginning, where you have the snail and you have subspecies X and subspecies Y. You don't observe while that happens, right? All you see in the end is a mix of several different species of snails, and you don't even know whether snail X, subspecies X, became subspecies Y over time, or whether they came from a completely different lineage. It's very difficult to reconstruct it. That's why PE is also just a model that does explain things very well in some cases, but maybe not in all cases.
So, yeah, well, this gets back to that point I brought up with Mary Schweitzer already. We don't even know what a species is. I'm like, well, okay, then what exactly is this discipline then, if we don't know what a species is? But then second of all, we have in the chat, Seamus O'Blaine says, in the Cambrian explosion, if creatures were more genetically flexible, simpler, could viruses have shunted genes between them easier, and they might have influenced each other's genomes easier? So with any proposed mechanism that I've seen, right, now we're going back to mechanism. Remember, because PE is trying to explain rapid changes from stasis to something new in a short amount of time, due to the lack of observed missing links. They're all the same as the gradualist. So I don't see how that adds speed at all. All you've done by selecting a smaller group is just saying that, okay, I can connect the dots a little bit faster. That's not, to me, that's not saying, hey, look, we're going to go from a bicycle to an airplane. That's a punctuation in transportation. But what was the mechanism? An intelligent agent, right? None of the mechanisms proposed that I see from PE don't anywhere near come close to being what we might call the. So if you have a good engine fuel, right, you can add an accelerant to it so that it burns hotter and faster, so it goes faster, like say with a jet engine. But you have to add that accelerant. What I was expecting to see with punctuated equilibrium was some sort of, here's this proposed accelerant that we have that we're going to add to this species population to speed it up. I didn't see them doing that. And I'm still left scratching my head like, okay, how does this create a quantitative change in a short amount of time? All I would see is that it'd be a little bit faster, sure, like the guy in the race car analogy, but it wouldn't be a fundamentally different thing.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think all they said is basically we make the population smaller, and then change can appear more easily, right? It's because the percentages are better.
Well, yeah, but there's another.
But doesn't mean that it's faster. Yeah, you're right.
But there's another problem, though, right? Too, because if they're going to start saying we need small population groups to manifest this change, and then they outcompete and cause the extinction of the previous group of biological organisms, it would not appear to me that the fossil record would bear that out, because what you would see is because these new forms that they're trying to account for are ubiquitous everywhere. That's not what you'd expect from a small population. So let's look at the Cambrian explosion, right? If it's a small population that was selected to get all these new life forms, by the time we see them, they're ubiquitous. What you would expect to see, if punctuated equilibrium were true, is a small amount of trilobites in a sea of protozoa. But that's not what you see. You see a sea of trilobites and not a lot of protozoa.
Yeah, I guess the explanation would be that you have that basically you're in the sea of trilobites, and you put like a small amount of trilobites into an evolutionary incubation chamber, seal it off for a couple thousand years, and then open it, and then these small species swim back in, and they have now a huge advantage over the other species, and will basically just outcompete them rapidly. And that's why you go from 100 trilobites to 1 million in a few generations, because this is now the superior form that really works very, very well, and then all the other trilobites are just not able to keep up. I think that would be explanation. That's why we see so many, because they say, the allopatric speciation has occurred, and all the species are back in the wild, and they completely wipe out everything else.
But the thing is, see, the limiting factor here, the bottleneck, is reproductive rates. What I'm saying is I don't think reproductive rates are fast enough, right? PE has only explained the rapidity of speciation, not the fact that you have reproductive rates that explode and allow this new life form to just dominate in thousands of years. Because I would still think reproductive rates would be a bottleneck.
They would, but if there's no competitors for food anymore, because your species can do everything so much better, then you can get. I mean, you start with 90 species A, 10 species B, and within the same time, you end up with 90 species B and 10 species A.
But how long would it take for, say, again, let's just say the trilobite is the example, because that's sort of what they want to talk about, because it's the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
I just don't see how a small population of trilobites in thousands of years would completely supplant all of these other life forms that have been there for allegedly hundreds of millions of years. Like they don't explain the increased rate of fecundity, which you'd have to also explain in order to see the complete hegemony of these new life forms.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can compare it to the introduction of predatory species, right? That all of a sudden take over the entire ecosystem and wipe out everything else that's in there. And then what was like a estuary with many different species now becomes dominated by some frog species from Australia and a few insects that can somehow keep up, and everything else is just gone.
But you see here, Florian, though, right? You're using an example of a small enclosed space.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about, the expansion outside of that small space by this new group. So the PE says the small space creates the environmental conditions for the rapid speciation. Okay. But then we have the whole world, which is now filled with trilobites in thousands of years, because that's the interval of change they're talking about. And I'm just like, what really? The reproductive rates are that fast?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
you're
like,
right.
well,
I
wait a
mean,
minute, guys. You. Even if I give you everything, even if I say, okay, Gould and Eldritch, I'll give you the speciation mechanism, and we have this little pond over here full of trilobites with like a vast world filled with protozoa.
yeah.
You're gonna fill that whole world up in thousands of years. What's the reproductive rate of a trilobite? I just don't see that.
Yeah, I can see. It's similar to abiogenesis, which should have occurred everywhere, right? And it's kind of flimsy. May have occurred here and there, but everything everywhere. And we talked about that. Like it's a model that explains some aspects, but it's maybe not suitable to explain like the entire change, the entire thing that happened around the entire planet, right? That's a very good point.
Because
I think
here's
the
the thing.
problem.
Let's say we have Pangea, right? Okay, we have Pangea,
Yeah.
one giant supercontinent, okay? And let's say one little peninsula is where PE takes place, and we have this new life form.
Okay.
Now all the land is contiguous, but it's the size of all 7 continents, right? That we have now. How long would it take that population to fill up Pangea? A long time, a really, really long time. Even if it were even if it was like super competitive. And I just don't think the fossil record would bear that out, because not only does PE have to explain the rapidity of speciation, but the complete hegemony of these species everywhere in the fossil record they observe it. And that's not a function of speciation, that's a function of population growth. And I mean, what the trilobite? I mean, none of these animals are going to reproduce faster than animals we see today. So, if I don't know what current rates of invertebrate reproduction are, but you know what I mean. It's like how quickly would this take?
Weeks. Like flies need like 10
Well,
days
for an
to
invertebrate, yeah.
But I mean, I don't know how it goes with marine life forms and trilobites. Yeah, they're certainly different arthropods, maybe not comparable with
Right.
modern ones, but it's probably quicker than human generation time. Let's say it like this.
But
it's
now,
probably
okay, so
slower than a bacterium reproduces, somewhere in between. Yeah.
right. So I'm using the trilobite because we're talking about the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
But let's apply PE to reptiles and mammals. Reproduce a lot slower, right? So how long would that take? For let's say you're you're an animal right after the KT event. Okay, you're a mammal, and now the Earth is empty of dinosaurs. And let's say PE selects for you to evolve into the Eohippus. Still, how long would it take to fill up the whole world? A long time. And I don't see, given that they want to deal with short time frames, to explain the speciation, the punctuation part, I don't see how they reproduce fast enough to be that hegemonic in the fossil record.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. 10,000 years. That's I think 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. That's the beginning of the that's the agrarian revolution, right? I think that's how you call it. Yeah. So and that means for example, whales. Just imagine a whale, of which we don't have many intermediate forms, evolved in that time frame. You're right. It's difficult to understand and difficult to reconcile with observations, because there are several animal species like whales and other mammals that are just not reproducing that quickly. And they're also pretty solitary. They don't really find one another so quickly. They don't swim that fast. It's difficult to see how some species can actually spread out. And trilobites, what are they doing? They're walking a few meters every day on the ocean floor. Are they really spreading that fast? That's a good question.
Because see, part of what makes PE, I think. I know that not Eldritch, the other Gould was a paleontologist.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Eldritch was the evolutionary biologist, right? Because it was both. Right?
Yeah.
It was interdisciplinary. That's the point. It was interdisciplinary. And coming at it from the fossil record angle, Gould was saying we don't have enough time between the jumps to account for gradualism to have occurred in certain cases, and we don't have enough missing links. Because when they're observed on the record, they're already hegemonic. They're already displacing all of the previous life forms when he's looking at them. Well, I'm like, okay, so you not only just have to explain the speed of speciation, you also have to explain the rate of reproduction. I don't see that. How that second part, I don't see that at all. Where is that coming from?
Yeah, I don't know.
So I would say, to sort of state my challenges to PE is one, all of the proposed selection pressures are more or less the same as the standard gradual model. The major alteration they're offering is that it can affect a small population group that's isolated more quickly, which I would agree. If we assume that model, that would be true. But is it qualitatively quicker? Is it enough to explain the thousands of years that they propose between these punctuations? And I don't see that, right? It would be like you have a jet engine and you wanted to go faster, you inject jet fuel, an accelerant. And that accelerant then... So what's the accelerant, right? If all the proposed mechanisms are the same, the only thing that we could consider an accelerant is geographic isolation, which even the standard model can account for. And we don't see it with the Galapagos finches, so that's a problem. I don't really see an accelerant. That's the first problem. The second problem is, even if I grant for the sake of argument everything up to this point, when you look at the problem from Gould's point of view, you have the ubiquity of these new species already in the fossil record. So you also have to explain the rates of reproduction. And if we're talking only thousands of years, that isn't enough time. That's not enough. You'd also have to propose a accelerated. I mean, it's like Star Wars: The Clone Wars. You're going to have like a clone army that matures in 10 years rather than 20. To get the adult males, ready to fight. Yeah. That's some real sci-fi stuff, and there's no way that Gould or Eldridge is proposing anything like that. I mean, yeah, even under the most optimal conditions, let's say you're this little peninsula of Pangaea right after the what was it? The Permian Triassic extinction. And you have very little opposition. That's still going to take a long time. I mean, reptiles have to lay eggs, incubate the eggs. That's going to take a long time. Or if you're a post-KT extinction mammal, it's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
How do we? Does that just to, there's very little competition, very little negative environmental pressures now because the disaster's over. And we just can control for population growth. I don't know. There's still a hard limit there that I don't see. Because even if we look at humanity with the all the advantages, say 10,000 years ago, with the beginning of the agricultural revolution, to get to 8 billion, but that's using technology, that's using all sorts of other things. Paleolithic man, most of them just died. Right? Most of them just died.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the agrarian revolution that we had the massive explosion of humanity. Well, no animal is going to do this. So we're going to assume these are going to be small, pressured populations. They still have to catch food, especially if you're a predator, right?
I mean, if you can basically see the agrarian revolution as a way to form an isolated habitat, right? Because we built cities, and we had our tribes we were tribal, and we built cities when we went from hunter-gatherer to plowing our fields. And so we built walls around our cities. We had buildings. We were basically building our own isolated habitat, right? So 10,000 years ago, humans still look pretty much the same as humans look today, right? Maybe they were a little taller today, but I don't see that much of a difference. There's a difference between Australopithecus and modern humans, yeah, but it's not really that much of a difference that you see since the agrarian revolution came up, right? So maybe there were environmental pressures that were unique to an agrarian environment, right? So basically, you selected for humans that were very good in organizing and managing things, for example. And that wasn't needed before, but that necessarily hasn't turned the whole human race into a different animal, right? We still look like pretty much the same that we looked 10,000 years ago. So there's no punctuated equilibrium there. It's just small change that is maybe a little bit biased towards properties that are useful in an agrarian or city state, but it's not really much of a drastic change.
Yeah. And then the third objection would be just a continuation of prior objections I have. And I'll just briefly reiterate some of them. Where is the information being selected for coming from? Okay, we've already been over that. The other one would be, why not assume that any change just defaults back to the mean eventually? How do we know that it's going to be preserved over time? That's another one.
Right.
Now PE would actually bypass the idea of intermediate stages. That's entirely why it was created, so that won't be a part of the objection. And let's see what other traditional objections would I have to that. Well, I guess mostly information and that. So those are my objections to challenges to PE. So what would you say to those, like all as an ensemble together from your point of view, Florian? Do you find that a compelling set of objections?
Well, yeah, I kind of find them compelling because, I mean, it's a compelling theory and it looks good on paper and it may have happened in some instances. But yeah, I mean, it's not easy to find much about punctuated equilibrium online. It's not easy to find much research on that, right? PE exists since 50 years. And I just saw another video that was explaining evolution, and they were saying in some cases, punctuated equilibrium perfectly explains how our phylogenetic tree was like this, and that. But that's it. They don't delve much deeper into it. So it seems to me like PE is just like an extra branch of evolutionary theory, an extra model that could have had some influence somewhere, sometime, but it's not like a entirely new explanation for evolutionary theory, and it's also may not always explain why the fossil record is missing. Somebody in the audience said it's probably missing because those things aren't there. Yeah, not sound.
Well, yeah,
right?
that's the other thing. But we also have seen Blaine say, could a distributed unity run simulations, or are the random shuffling of the conceptual life experiments just spitballing? Well, see, this is very interesting, okay? Because that is a possible objection. Are these processes too random to simulate?
Are they what to simulate?
Are these processes too random to simulate? That seems to be one point that Blaine is bringing up. Well, this just then undermines the entire credibility of the Darwinian project, because Charles Darwin, in The Origin of Species, specifically mentions human selective breeding, which is not random by definition. So how can you propose a random theory of selection by observing non-random choices that humans make in breeding animals as your observational evidence? That's the observational evidence he's pointing to, but that's not random.
No, I mean, you would say that instead of humans designing humans like trying to create new dog species, you have a mountain massif, or you have like a mountain plateau in 2,000 feet elevation, and now all of a sudden there's a different selection pressure there, and ergo you have different species that live up there high in the mountain, right? So that's not really random. That's not really a human designer. It's also not completely random. It's basically the baseline that we have is not random, not some random zero, but some randomness that resembles geographical and climatic realities in different areas in the world.
Okay, actually, Florian, I got a really good thing. It just came to me as you were talking. Okay, if you want to explain short bursts of speciation, right, and you want to find an explanation, the actual explanation is intelligence, and here's why. Let's look at when dogs were first domesticated. sometime, 6,000 years ago? It was a while, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think so.
Now,
that's the agrarian era came apart.
Well, maybe even, let's say 10,000 years ago then.
Yeah, something around there.
Well, in the same amount of time, the natural selection pressures have not produced the level of breeds of wolves that humans have created breeds of dogs, which means that nature isn't that fast. Humans are, but nature isn't. So the only way to explain this is intelligence. This is a test control experiment. We have intelligent human beings selectively breeding for dogs, and then we have nature putting selection pressure on wolves. And in the same amount of time, where do we see the diversity? We see it with dog breeds. We see it with intelligent agency.
Yeah, that's true.
Not nature's selection pressures. That hit me. It just hit me as you were talking, and I'm like, this is it. The same animal, right? We're not even talking about a common ancestor. We're talking about the same animal, wolves, right? It's not even like, chimps and humans diverge from a common ancestor. No. We're talking about the same species. Canis lupus, right? So where's the change? Well, the change that we see occurs due to human agency, not nature. So if you want to explain rapid changes, you're going to have to appeal to intelligence. I don't know what else. What else can you do?
Yeah. So then you could easily test it, right? You could easily test it by looking at how fast wolf populations evolved and how fast dog populations evolve, right? Dog populations have evolved over a design process, and wolf populations have not had a design process, but the process was determined by geographical realities. Let's say it like that, and some other, basically the whole environment, which is different in different parts of the world. So basically, would that account for any of the diversity of species we see alone and by itself? And that's the big question, right?
Well, the other thing too is humans have claimed territory that was once wolf territory. They're being confined, especially in North America, to ever smaller and smaller regions, which should, in theory, create PE selection pressures.
Yeah, very, very true too.
But what we don't see is the rapid speciation of wild Canis lupus. But we do see these dog breeds, which again, that's where Darwin starts, human domestication of animals. That's all done by intelligence under specific conditions that are not nature. And if we compare that to wolves, right? Because again, we're not even talking about a proposed common ancestor. They're the same animal. I mean, if many dog breeds can't reproduce with wolves because they're artificially hampered by small size or whatnot, but the average size dog or the large dog could. So, the accelerant is intelligence. So what I would argue, from observational data of human-wolf relations and wolf pressure under human conditions and nature just isn't that fast.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think proposes a problem for both versions, but that's where I'm going to end right now.
Good point.
Well, is there anything you want to end with before we wrap it up? I thought that was a pretty good end point for me anyhow.
I think that's a good point to end it. Yeah.
Here we go. Here's the ending point. We're going to end it with you, Sima Sublime. The case for intelligent design is mounting from different angles, which many might have found crazy only a few years ago. The key is what type of intelligence and to what degree and in what cases. Yes, that's the end. That's the end quote. Thank you, Sima Sublime.
Very good.
This is Todd Lewis. Oh, Florian, thanks for having you on. Always a pleasure. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.